Thank you for all of the staff. And I am grateful to be with all of you this morning. It's afternoon, I think, on my end, but this morning to talk about harnessing the faith community's assets for social impact. I'll start with just a little bit more about me to frame our conversation together today. Along with all of the titles that I have, I also see myself as a social impact activist. I see my work as guiding faith-inspired leaders and organizations to embrace their passions and discover their purpose to make life-changing impact, and particularly to make life-changing impact in the communities that they serve. I am a pastor. I am a professor. I've been on the faculty of Garrett Evangelical for over 25 years. And I put producer here because it's a carryover from what I'm sure some of you had to do also during the pandemic, where we had to move everything online, and you spent your week trying to figure out how to produce a meaningful, inspiring worship experience for those who could not gather together in person. And I find this work of being a producer continuing in other aspects of work, even on this other side of the pandemic. And so I'm grateful and honored to been given this opportunity to share with you. I'm looking forward to our time together and our interactions when we get to our Q&A time. As we begin walking through our time together, I would like for you to keep in the back of your mind and kind of working through these two particular questions. If you had one wish for the larger community in which your church is located, what would that be? I think I lost. There we go. There we go. If you had one wish for the larger community in which your church is located, what would it be? And think about one primary hindrance to your wish becoming a reality. You may even want to place your answer in the chat section if you like to share that with others. If you had one wish for your larger community in your church, in which your church is located, what would it be? And to name one primary hindrance to your wish becoming a reality. So I want to start our conversation with this verse, Jeremiah 29:11. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. This particular verse is at least one of the scriptures that guides the work of the Oikos Institute for Social Impact, which I'll share a little bit more about in a few moments. Why does it do so? Because we all know Jeremiah 29:11, or at least most of us know Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you. Plans for a future, plans for us to prosper, not to harm you. What is not often talked about is Jeremiah 29:7, and in particular, what comes prior to Jeremiah 29:7. To really make sense of this verse is reading Jeremiah 28. In Jeremiah 28, the people are in exile in Babylon, and a prophet of the time, Hananiah, comes before the people and say, I know we're in difficult situations, but I received a word from the Lord that says, we will only be in this for 2 years. So hang in there. God's going to come. God's going to rescue us. God's going to put things back into perspective as they once were. And we will only have to endure this for 2 years. Well, it seems that Jeremiah gets a different word from God. And God essentially says to Jeremiah, you need to tell all the other prophets and the people that Hananiah lied. I did not say that. You will be where you are placed, where you are now planted for at least 70 years. So get comfortable. Get married, build family, all of that, because you're going to be here for 70 years. And then it says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city of where you find yourself now. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. There's something very insightful about this verse, because I think it also suggests a way for us to think about where we find our current congregations planted. Some of us have been there already for a while, and others will continue to have longevity in the place where your congregation is planted. Are we seeking the peace and prosperity of the city, of the community of which we are planted? How are we thinking about how that community prospers? Because if we're able to apply anything from this verse of scripture, if our community prospers, our congregation prospers. And another insight that has come to me, particularly in light of many of our congregations being much more commuting, our members commuting in and out of the communities where our church is currently planted, we may have members who are not necessarily direct members of the neighborhood, members of the community. But that does not keep the congregation itself from being good neighbors. We are called to be good neighbors of the community of which we are located. We're called to be good neighbors of where we're called to do ministry, and not to just be siloed away within our four walls. So what does it mean then for us to be seeking the prosperity, not just of our local congregation, but also of the community that we find ourselves situated? Because again, if Jeremiah 29:7 has any impact, the impact is when the community where we are serving prosper, we prosper. And that's why the Oikos Institute for Social Impact was founded, to assist and aid congregations to begin thinking about how we can help our congregation prosper, as well as our community to prosper, using what we call fishing differently. And I'm going to go just real quickly through this, and we're going to come back to it in a little bit more detail. But fishing differently comes out of a model that my co-founder, the Reverend Dr. Sidney Williams, out of Morristown, New Jersey, who's the pastor of Bethel AME in Morristown, framed it, matter of fact, in his doctor of ministry project. But he's a former banker, former uh, 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 venture capitalist person, who God called him, went to seminary, and wrestled with how do we make sense of this whole thing that we call it economics and economy and finances and faith. How do we put all of those things into conversation? And he shaped this model called F.I.S.H. F.I.S.H stands for faith capital or financial capital, which is the money and assets that communities and of faith place in collection place in our tithe box and all of that, to help take care of the resource, take care of the needs and necessities of the community. But it's stepping back and asking the question: is what we collect Sunday morning sufficient to really finance what it is that God is desiring and calling us into doing, what we call God-sized vision and dreams? And what we're helping congregations to realize at the Oikos Institute for Social Impact, that you have more assets available to you than just what you have in the collection plate. The other asset that we would offer is that you have intellectual capital. And again, I'll delve into that a little bit more, but bottom line is right there amongst your membership, you have gifts and talents and spheres of influence sitting right there in your congregation. If called upon to make the kind of impact that God is calling you to do in your community, if we are truly calling upon that intellectual capital, we have more to build on, to really make that God-sized vision manifest, come to life. But then we also have social capital. And social capital is recognizing that our congregations really were not brought together to be an island unto itself. That there are persons, there are organizations right outside our community that when we're clear about our vision, when we're clear about our own missional identity, when we're clear about the God-sized vision that God is calling our congregation to engage in, that there are organizations, persons right outside our doors who are also in alignment with what we are being called to do, that we should be able to partner with to be able to make a greater difference. And all of this boils down to: how do we truly cultivate and build human capital, in where our congregations are encouraging and building up the life of others? And so we'll delve more deeply into F.I.S.H in a moment, but I just wanted to put that also on your thoughts, on your hearts and minds, as we begin to work through this. How do we even begin to think about fishing differently? What's necessary for us to engage in and immerse ourselves in before we even begin to start thinking about fishing differently? And I want us to begin thinking about imagination. So if you don't mind, in the chat, what one word comes to mind when you think about imagination? Give you a few moments to do that. And I'm seeing dreaming, possibility, inner vision, seeing beyond the walls. What other words come to mind? Innovative, options, grand, limitless, no limits, more power. This is great. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. I might be a bit out of line. You may even disagree with me, but I think that there's something that happened coming out of the pandemic that really had a major impact on our ability to imagine. For many, at least for the colleagues that I have engaged with, whom I have great respect for and love, it was something about the pandemic that created even more of a mindset of scarcity and much more of a focus of trying to get back to what once was, only now to have to really struggle and realize that there's not a normal to go back to, that the dust is still settling, and we're still trying to figure out what the new normal will be. I'm going to take a major leap and suggest that we're still probably 3 to 5 years away from anything really being normal. And in light of all that is happening in our world, even by the time we get to something called normal, there will be another shifting again. And so the question before us is, in the midst of the shifting, in the midst of whatever we might call normal not being normal anymore, how do we draw upon this thing called imagination to begin moving us forward? And more importantly, being able to see what God is up to in our world and what we're striving to do. So when I think about imagination, here's the definition: the faculty or action of forming new ideas. Hear that? Forming new ideas, not recapturing old ideas. Forming new ideas, or images, or concepts that at the moment we can't necessarily touch or feel, but we have the ability for the possibility to emerge. The ability of the mind to be creative and resourceful. And I like that one, the ability of the mind to be creative and resourceful, because it takes me back to this. In the beginning, God created. I'm sure that there are an infinite number, a plethora, a number of ways Genesis 1 and 1 could have started. Genesis 1 and 1 started with, in the beginning, God created. In the beginning, God used God's imagination and began creating a world. And what's so powerful about that also for me is just a few verses later, it says, so God created humankind in God's image. If we embrace the notion of Imago Dei, about humankind being made in the image of God, what that says then for me is that humankind possesses some of the attributes of who God is. And I want to argue that at least two attributes that we as humankind possess, that God possesses, is the ability to love and the ability to create. That is it, that is in our DNA. It's in who we are. We have the ability, because we possess the attributes of God, to love and to create. To love and to create. And so the question becomes, how are we truly utilizing these attributes that we already possess within us? Khalid Keith Perry has a book called Sense of the Possible, an introduction to theology and imagination. And what Keith Perry suggests is that it isn't that the options are imagination and no imagination. It is that patterns of imagination wrestle with one another for our attention. And we form habits and practices that maintain or disrupt ways of imagining. Living in a world with no imagination is actually living in a world where the imagination of those in power generate the dominant stories, symbols, and hopes for the age. And so it's not that we can't imagine, because again, if we can live into this notion of Imago Dei, we all carry the attributes of love and creativity. We already know how to imagine. Question becomes, which patterns of imagination are we allowing to guide our ability, our way of creating, of thinking outside the box, as some folks said, to be able to determine whether or not we are limited in our thinking or unlimited. That we believe that we have power for doing good, or powerless, or even power to do evil. What patterns of imaginations do we find ourselves wrestling with that either helps to move us forward or hold us back, particularly as we find ourselves in a season where the ground has shifted and there is not a normal to go back to? What are we drawing on? And so for a few moments, I'd like to for you to go into breakout groups and begin thinking about this question. What are some of the things that get in the way of our ability to imagine? What are some of the things that get in the way of our ability to imagine? So why don't you go ahead and place in the chat either a word or phrase or sentence that helps us to understand your thoughts, what y'all talked about as far as what hinders the ability for us to imagine. And friends, all of these are what many are wrestling with as they struggle to figure out what to do, and yet recognizing that they either find themselves paralyzed, find themselves in a place of inertia, but unable to move to that space to be able to breathe and imagine again. And we could spend a whole half a day on this conversation of imagination. But But let me just say, take seriously these things that we've named as things that get in the way of our ability to imagine, and then begin to, with others, begin to figure out how do we work through these barriers, because it's going to be working through these barriers that's going to free us up to be able to really and truly see what's possible, to see um, um, uh, how God wants us to move forward in our God-sized dreams, to be able to make impact in the lives of others. I bring you back to the fishing differently model, that I still want, for those of us who are committed to generosity and tithing, to giving, that is a spiritual discipline. We never want to move away from encouraging others to live a life of generosity, to live a life of giving. And if tithing is one of those principles that you adhere to, that we continue to encourage folk to tithe. It's a spiritual discipline. Um, but we also should come to the realization that it still may not be totally sufficient to exercise, to live out the God-sized dream that God has for your congregation and the community for which God had called you to. Because again, when the community prospers, the congregation prospers. And so what else can then we can begin to imagine, we can draw from, that we could leverage to really live out the call that God has for us? And one of them is being intellectual capital, is getting to know the people in your pews, not just knowing their name, not just knowing what choir they sing in, or what usher board they might be on, or what other leadership role in the congregation that they have, but what are the other gifts and talents that they have that they're probably using Monday through Saturday, that we in our congregations have not tapped into, to assist us in the kind of call that God has for us. We have such special gifts sitting right there in our pews, and gifts and talents that go untapped because we've not taken the time to truly know the knowledge, skills, experience, and stories of the people sitting right there in our pews. We need to build intellectual capital so we know what to call on as we tune into what it is that God is calling us to do where we're planted. And then what's the network of relationships right outside our doors that we also can tap into? Who else is caring about affordable housing? Who else is caring about issues of food insecurity? Who else is caring about public education? Who else is caring about other needs, workforce development? Who else is caring about other needs within our communities that we care about, that we could partner with, that allows us to be able to maximize resources for greater impact, greater work, that ultimately leads to the building of human capital within our communities. So you've heard me talk about the fact that I am a social impact activist. That I'm the co-founder of the Oikos Institute for Social Impact. And I want to make an argument right now, very briefly, that this whole work of community engagement, community transformation, communal social impact is not just charitable work. It's not just social service work. But I want to make an argument that this is the work of discipleship. What do I mean? My My PhD is in practical theology with a focus around Christian education, youth and young adult ministry. I do workshops a lot around this whole notion of discipleship. And when I've done these workshops, I've often brought to mind of those participating those verses that spoke that where Jesus is speaking with his disciples after they've been with him for 2.5 years, and he asked them the question, who do the people say that I am? And they rattle off a few names and others, and then he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah, Son of the living God. And Jesus says, flesh and blood did not reveal that to you. Upon this rock, I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I said, and then I asked those who are participating, if Jesus was here before you and asked the same question, who do you say that I am? How would you answer? And they gave the same answer that Peter did. And oftentimes I'm before Black faith community audiences. And so I would also get Lily of the Valley, Bright and Morning Star, Rose of Sharon. I get all of these wonderful answers about who Jesus is, who they would say Jesus is. And I would affirm their answers and say, you are absolutely right. You've answered as Peter has answered. You have spoken well of who Jesus is. But then I would ask the question, of all of the things that you have named, what can you emulate? What can you imitate? What can you copy? And I ask that question because to be a disciple, to truly be a disciple, means to be an emulator of the one who taught you. To be an emulator of the one, to be an imitator of the one who has served as your teacher and your guide. And even though all of the answers that were given were correct, they only spoke to Jesus's divinity. And we cannot be, or it would be extremely difficult for us to be, emulators, disciples of Jesus's divinity. For many of us, our faith teaches us that Jesus was fully human, fully divine, and fully human. What we're called to then look to emulating is not Jesus's divinity, but what did Jesus do in his humanity that we are then called to go and do likewise? And I can't help then but think of Matthew 25, 34, and 40. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then these righteous ones will reply, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will say, I tell you the truth, when you did it for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. Beloved, this is discipleship work. So when we are engaged in works of eradicating food insecurity, it's not charitable work. It's not just outreach work. It's not social service work. It was, I was hungry and you fed me. It's discipleship work. When I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. That's discipleship. When we're dealing with issues related to water purity and making sure that our children have clean water to drink, that's not charitable work. That's discipleship work. When I was a stranger, you invited me into your home. When we are dealing with issues around those who find themselves unhoused, and we are working toward making sure that they have what they need to have shelter and to be housed for those who desire to be. That's not charitable work. That's discipleship work. Social impact is acts of discipleship for those of us who are striving to emulate the ways of Jesus. That's what we that's the power within many of our congregations to really engage in this work of social impact, because when we are doing it for the least of these, we are doing it as if we're doing it for the one for whom we say that we are emulating. Social impact is acts of discipleship. So let me delve in that just a little bit further. Social impact is the effect of an individual or organization's actions that their actions have on the social fabric of a community. Let me give you one more insight into social impact given to us by Dr. Matthew Williams, the former president of the Interdenominational Theological Seminary.
What I'm compelled by around social impact is the idea that the world as it is not a given. It's a set of choices that we have accepted, inherited, and in some cases we extend into the future. But what the language of social impact suggests that we have the capacity to co-create a new reality, right? By repositioning our relationships, the way we relate to one another, so that, the sister who was deemed outside the realm of respectability now gets to manage resources because she can see what the sisters in the missionary board couldn't see, right? It's a repositioning of relationship that changes the conditions under which we live together, right? That for me is what social impact does, that sometimes the advocacy and justice work doesn't do. I mean, we use the term speaking truth to power. And it always makes me wonder, well, where do we think power is?
Yeah.
If we're speaking truth to power, does that render us powerless, right? Or social service that assumes that the resources always have to be given out from where we stand. Social impact gives us an opportunity to actually recreate the way we live, relate to one another, and distribute resources for flourishing, not just kind of running through the maze as it exists, but really rewiring the way we live and we work together.
I'm back to this one. And so you heard from Dr. Williams this call to recognize the resources that are available to us and begin thinking about, again, this whole notion of imagination. How can we begin to think about ways of recreating the resources that are available to us, that leans toward the flourishing of God's people, that leans toward the flourishing of the folk that are in the communities for which we serve. Let me then now share with you, before I send you to another breakout, this clip from Reverend Tracy Blackman, as she essentially talks about how she worked with her congregation to begin thinking about, not using her words, so fishing differently, but beginning to think about how she helped her congregation begin thinking about engaging in social impact.
When I became pastor of the church that I serve, which is a Black church, there was not good community presence, but there was good community memory. The members had once lived around the church, a lot of them, and as economic conditions improved for them, or the need to live closer to where they worked, moved them from this area where our church is into other areas. And they maintained their commitment to the church and maintained their memory of the neighborhood, right? And so now we're driving into church. It's a small congregation because the church had gone through some splits by the time that I arrived. And they're driving in for Bible study and for choir rehearsal and for all the meetings, and are faithful in that. And in their mind, the neighborhood is the same. They just don't live in it anymore. When in fact, the neighborhood still had houses, and the houses were not unkempt or anything like that, but the neighborhood had changed drastically. The people who were in those houses were now renters, and the school next door was 85% free and reduced lunch. And if you paid attention to the neighborhood, you would notice that all of the family kind of gathering spaces have been closed down and been replaced with fast food places or pawn shops or check cashing places. But they had not noticed that, because sometimes we don't notice the water that we're swimming in. And so when I came, the mandate was, we want you to grow this church. And the questioner asked, how do you reintroduce the community to the church? And the path that I chose to take was to reintroduce the church to the community. So I had them meet me on a couple of Saturdays. I asked them, well, tell me about this neighborhood. I'd already done my research. I didn't live in that neighborhood, but I'd already done my research. And I knew the neighborhood, but I wanted to see what they were going to say. And they started telling me about the neighborhood they lived in. And I said, okay, well, I tell you what, let's meet up here a couple of Saturdays. And I had door knockers made about the church, inviting people to church. I said, let's just go door to door and introduce ourselves to the neighbors and get a feel. And it didn't take long for them to realize how much the neighborhood had changed, right? And so then we started talking about the statistics, and I did a series called The Door of the Church is Open. And I suggested that that invitation need not just be a spiritual invitation, but a literal invitation to the doors of the church. And a challenge that if we open the doors of this church right now, that the people who would come into the doors from our neighborhood may not exactly look like the people who are inside. They may not have the education you have, and they may not drive cars like we drive. There's a bus stop right at our corner now, in case you didn't notice. They may walk in. Some of them may not come in with money to give to the church. They may come in needing our help. We did all of that and started our reorientation. So from that, we had a big church with a small membership. And the church was on board for opening the doors of the church after they found out who the community was. And we chose not to open the doors for traditional handout, which is needed, but there were churches already doing that. We chose to offer space. And so we offered space to neighborhood people who had ideas about how to improve the community at no cost to them, as long as they would serve the community at reduced rates or serve the community free of charge. And from that, this church that only had 30 members became the host to a robotics team. We got GED classes. We got a girls mentoring program. We got dance classes. These weren't people that were in church on Sundays. They came during the week and did these services. And from that, then the church members wanted to do more. So we became an incubator. We had a commercial kitchen. We began to incubate businesses. Our first one was a catering service. We allowed them to incubate for 3 years. And all they had to do was tithe off of the money they were making so they could build their business before they went out without a lot of overhead. We've done a couple of other businesses like that since then. And then the church began to see the needs of the community. So we had a lot of elderly people who didn't have computers. We opened a computer lab and we started computer classes for elderly people. But it was because the church reconnected with the community. And then the community came to the church. And it was out of that connection, because we started doing funerals for, there was a lot of violence, and we started doing funerals for people who died that weren't members of the church. And because of one of those funerals, someone at that funeral kept my card and said, when Michael Brown died, said, "You've been my pastor since you did this funeral last year, and will you come and be out here with me in Canfield?" That's how I ended up in Canfield Partners when I did, right? So I think that the church needs to reframe its mind from how can we get the church, the community, to be interested in us, to how can we promote a theology that compels us to be interested in the community. Because the church really isn't in the buildings. The church is in the ministries that we do.
I'm looking at the time, and so I was going to send you into another breakout room, but what I'd like for you to do is to think about these questions here as you begin to think about your own ministry and what you might be feeling, or at least, or maybe even know already what God is calling your particular community and organizations to be about. And so imagine a world where your community, where your organization, congregation is planted, is thriving and flourishing. And when you walk out the doors of your organization, your congregation, what do you see? Imagine that outside is already thriving and flourishing. What do you see? And what is your congregation, what is your organization contributing to that community's thriving and flourishing? How is your congregation being part of the broader social capital of that community? How would you like to see your congregation, your organization being a part, contributing to the larger, greater social capital ecosystem of your community? Because let me let you in on a secret. If you can see it, you've already begun the work of imagination. And if you can see it, you've already begun the work of developing the plan for its actualization. But we cannot actualize what we cannot see. But if you're already being able to see what's possible, you've already begun the work of making it happen. So just some food for thought. What is God up to in the community God entrusted to your care? Again, if we had a whole nother half a day, I could talk more about seeing your commitment to your community as also acts of stewardship. God has entrusted that community to your care. What is God up to in the community God entrusted to your care? What if you believe your congregation organization can be an agent of change and transformation in the place that you've been planted. Again, just food for thought. What if you believe there was more available to you than you could see right now? And what if you believe God can do more for you, your church, and your community than you could ever ask, think, or imagine? Let me close with this passage from Welcoming Justice by Charles Marsh and John M. Perkins. And this particular chapter, this comes out of a particular chapter that John Perkins wrote. And he said, the job of an evangelist is to connect God's good news with people's deep yearnings. Revival movements are always about connecting the gospel to a cause. Revivalist Charles Finney saw the class system, and what he's talking about here is the economic class system, developing during the industrialization, and connected Jesus's good news for the poor with a movement for social change. In fact, the altar call was invented by him. He asked people to come forward and give their lives to Jesus, but he also invited them to give their lives to a cause. That's what the altar call was about. There was work to be done in the movement, and those people who responded were saying, you can call on me. They were enlisted as foot soldiers in a campaign for the kingdom of God. What is God calling us to do and to be about in the communities for which God has entrusted to our care? Is connecting what we know of God to be. And again, for me, that is being that of carrying the attributes of love and creation, being able to create, to make a difference in the lives of God's people.